And to be honest, I'm not entirely sure. I might end up just abandoning the aspect of using the audio. It doesn't matter. But basically, either I'll use the audio or I won't. But it's an academic thing, so yeah. So yeah, you happy to just answer the questions?
Yeah.
Right. So, first question I think is the broadest. In brief terms, what is the feminist objection to contemporary trans rights activism, and what do you understand contemporary trans rights activism to be?
I mean, basically the objection to trans rights activism from a feminist perspective is that I'll speak for myself.
Yeah, that makes
Trans
sense.
rights activism misunderstands the difference between sex and gender. So the feminist analysis of gender is, we would probably be more likely to use the term gender role. So gender means, that it just refers to the set of stereotypes assumed about or imposed on a person based on their sex. So femininity and masculinity. So the idea that, because a boy is born male, he will inherently prefer blue over pink and playing with trucks over playing with dolls, and he won't like dresses, and he'll be more aggressive, maybe more active, maybe more interested in building things, whereas little girls are presumed to be more interested in pretty things, in dresses, in pink, in playing with dolls, and sort of nurturing activities, taking care of babies, cooking, things like that, will be less aggressive, more agreeable, more passive. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about gender, those stereotypes, those assumptions, those roles, which we don't believe to be wholly applicable to anyone, which is not to say necessarily that there isn't any sort of validity in terms of, evolutionary impacts in terms of gender. Obviously men and women have had different roles over the past however many thousands of years.
Yeah.
So and there are obviously differences between men and women physically, biologically, in terms of what they're able to do. Obviously, what the basic one is, women are able to get pregnant and reproduce. But also, men have different bodies than women. They're physically stronger. They're generally taller. They're generally bigger. Their bones move in different ways. Their hips move differently when they walk. All sorts of things like that. But that's a whole other tangent. I mean, essentially, people have personalities. So people are going to have different likes and dislikes, adopt different behaviors. Some of those likes and dislikes, some of those behaviors might fit within stereotypical masculinity and femininity, but I don't believe that, any one person is wholly and perfectly masculine in terms of those personality traits and characteristics and likes and dislikes, or that any one person is wholly feminine. People are going to have a mix of different characteristics and behaviors and all sorts of things based on, I don't know. I can't even say. Some of it's going to be socialization. Some of it's going to be upbringing. Some of it might be inherent. That whole nature versus nurture debate. It's probably a mix of both. But any case, the main issue with trans rights activism is that they aren't really fighting for rights. I obviously support everyone's right to not be harassed or discriminated against, to live a life of dignity, to be able to live in a way that feels authentic to them. But my experience has been that trans activists are insistent on tearing down women's spaces in particular. So in destroying what women have built up over decades, mainly through the feminist movement. So spaces like transition houses, the destruction of women's sports, ensuring access to women's change rooms and washrooms, the transferring of men to women's prisons. So they're trying to fight for access specifically for men to have access to women's spaces wherein women and girls are often quite vulnerable.
Yeah.
So what they're fighting for in many ways endangers women. And I mean,
What, just out of interest, sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but what would be a very good contemporary example of that trans rights activists really damaging the integrity of women's only spaces that you can think
well,
of?
I think the sports example is a good example.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Essentially, if we allow males to compete with and against girls or women in sport, there is no more women's sport. I mean, it's not fair. Like, women and girls aren't able to compete on fair ground against men, again, because of those physical differences that you can't get rid of through transition. Testosterone and surgery doesn't undo the process of going through puberty, which is the thing that, the main thing that ensures boys and girls develop differently. So men will still have, different bone density, different muscle mass. Again, the way that they walk and move will be different no matter what hormones they're on or what surgeries they have. And so they're going to have an advantage over women. A mediocre male athlete who can't really compete among other males, or at least can't win, is going to be able to easily compete against and win against women and girls. And it just negates the whole competition. I mean, women and girls who trained and fought their whole lives to compete are suddenly not in a position to compete fairly. And girls in high school will be losing out on scholarships and things like that. It's something that's already happening. The issue of men in women's prisons, of course, is a big one too. Men are already being transferred to women's prisons and assaulting women in those prisons, and very little is being done. Nothing's being done in Canada, that's for sure. They've fully ignored this issue and continued to allow this to go on.
Yeah, okay. I'm happy to move on to the next question if you are happy.
Sure.
So do you think that there may be some cases of children being encouraged to identify themselves as transgender at an age before it's entirely appropriate, or for reasons that are illegitimate?
Yeah, I think that the trans trend is incredibly dangerous for children. And what's happening now is that girls and boys who, just a few decades ago, or even a couple decades ago, when I was growing up in the 80s, who, if I wanted to play with trucks and I hated pink and I didn't want to wear dresses and I wanted to play with the boys, which was true when I was a kid, that was fully accepted, and it never occurred to me or anyone else to say that, oh, maybe I'm actually a boy. Like, I wasn't. I was a girl who just didn't like stereotypical girl things. And growing up in a feminist household and in a world, that was, a post second wave feminism world, that was totally acceptable, and that was the progressive way to approach kids. Like, kids should be able to play with whatever they want to play with and dress however they want to dress. It shouldn't be limited to that rigid gender binary, as academics would call it. But now, girls like me, boys who want to wear dresses or play with dolls, or just want to play with the girls instead of the boys, are being told that maybe they're born in the wrong body, which is a horrible message to give to a kid. No kid is born in the wrong body. There's nothing wrong with kids' bodies. There's nothing wrong with kids' brains just because, they want to play with girls' toys or boys' toys or whatever it is, or wear dresses. I mean, it's a totally sexist, regressive concept that says that girls are defined by these sexist roles and boys are defined by these sexist roles. And that's something feminists have been fighting against for, the entirety of the feminist movement, essentially, to escape these rigid roles, to say, no, like, women are not inherently delicate and irrational and over emotional. And, we're fully capable of participating in public life and in this world just like men are. These are damaging stereotypes, and they've been used historically as an excuse to keep women in the home and to prevent them from going to university and voting and participating in politics and being out in public, even, being at the bar. So yeah, and I mean, beyond that, it sounds to me, from having read about and talked to lots of girls in particular who've been put on the path towards transition and then detransitioned, you can go to a therapist, and what the therapists are expected to do is go along with the affirmation model, which means that if a kid approaches you and says, I think I'm trans, you're supposed to say, yes, you're trans, here are your hormones. They're not supposed to question you at all. And that's really dangerous because kids are being put on puberty blockers and then hormones that destroy their bodies for life and put them on a path towards getting equally as destructive and potentially dangerous surgeries.
That definitely, I think that's pretty much answered that. I did have another question about women's only spaces, but I think you would say you probably covered that enough. But I did have one question which I was very interested to hear, which was, do you believe that the queer theory understanding of gender is helpful for a feminist analysis of gender? I think you kind of hinted this, but I thought I'd be interested to hear your answer to that question specifically. So specifically, because you said that the feminist understanding of gender is, or I guess you'd say the gender critical feminist understanding of gender, however you want to talk about it, is that gender is about gender roles. And obviously a queer theory argument is that there's gender identity and there's gender expression. And I guess what I'm wondering is, do you think that understanding of gender is helpful or extremely harmful, and to what extent for a feminist understanding of gender?
Right. So I guess, I mean, it seems to me that the queer theory understanding of gender is rooted in postmodernism. So that is to say, there is no material reality. There is no objective truth. There's only subjective truth, which means it's up to the individual to determine what's real and what's not. So if you feel like a man, whatever that means, that's a completely undefinable thing. There's no such thing as feeling like a man or feeling like a woman. You just are. It's just a biological reality. You have a male body, female body. I don't know what that means to feel like a woman. I'm sure that I feel very different than, another woman down the street for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
But that it just means that, suddenly material reality is determined by an individual feeling, which, I get one of the main questions I often ask around this topic is, when people tell me trans women are women, or, kids are whatever they say they are, or people are whatever they say they are, if I say I'm a man, then you have to accept the fact that I'm a man and not question me, is like, what is a man and what is a woman? And if we can't define what a woman is in any kind of, cohesive way, what even is a woman's right? What are we fighting for? What's feminism? Why, what is this movement about if not fighting for female rights? And, fighting against male violence against women in particular, globally. But yeah, I think that it seems to me that the queer theorists have conflated sex and gender. So they're saying, gender is not binary, stop putting people in this binary. And we're saying, we know gender is not binary. We invented that. We've been talking about this I'm saying we, like the feminist movement. Obviously, I wasn't around during the second wave. But this is what feminists have been fighting for decades, to say gender is not binary. We're not limited to these stereotypes. But what they actually mean is that sex isn't binary, which of course it is. But they don't say that. They say gender is not binary, and then they sort of manipulatively. I don't know if they're I sort of suspect they're being unclear on purpose, but maybe they're just not very intelligent. It's really hard to determine. Like maybe they don't know what they're talking about actually, and they don't know what the difference between sex and gender is. A lot of people seem to conflate those terms. But yeah, they sort of alternate back and forth between sex and gender when they're writing or talking about this. And so they'll say, gender isn't binary, stop forcing people into these categories. And then they'll say, like male and female are not, what would they say? I'm trying to think of the word. Anyway, they conflate it into an argument that says that male and female are not binary, and there's all these in-between categories, and then they'll start referencing other cultures. Like they'll be like indigenous cultures, and in India there's third categories, and nobody thinks that there's only male and female, which is total bullshit. Every culture that has ever existed around the entire world for all of history has known the difference between males and females, and know that males and females exist. They know how babies are made. And there are some cultures where there's what might be referred to, if you're speaking from a Western, like it's weird to apply Western understandings and Western academic theories to these other cultures that you're not really familiar with at all. But what might be called a third gender, but they don't believe that those third genders are literally, like, they don't believe that dissolves the categories of male and female. They don't believe that male and female don't exist. They've just created this other category. Usually it's for effeminate men.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's just sort of, they're sort of, they're imposing their sort of Western academic jargon on other cultures to bolster their nonsensical arguments. I don't know if that answered your question or not.
No, that perfectly did. Okay, so this one. Do you have any concerns about how the current political culture surrounding trans activism may impact free speech?
Yeah, I mean, so what trans activists have done, and other leftist activists are doing this as well, is to say that anything that challenges their ideology is hate speech and is dangerous and puts trans people at risk. They'll even say that these ideas are violence. And so they've created this entire discourse that turns what is a political or ideological disagreement into literal violence or literal harm or literal hate speech. And either they seem to want to criminalize that speech, which means, for example, that if you refer to a man who identifies as a woman as he, that's called misgendering, and that's hate speech or a hate crime or violent somehow. But it's a complete manipulation, because nobody's saying anything hateful when they're challenging ideology. What I'm talking about and what the women that I'm allied with in this movement are talking about has nothing to do with hate, has nothing to do with fear, absolutely has nothing to do with violence. It's about making arguments, particularly arguments in defense of women and girls. But it's completely, I think it's completely dangerous to start framing words and ideas and arguments and debate as violence and hate speech and as a hate crime, for obvious reasons, because I don't know how we can have a dialogue or advocate for women's rights in this case. This can be extended to other areas as well, if we're not allowed to say these things. If we're not allowed to talk about the question of what is a woman, and if we're not allowed to talk about how gender identity legislation impacts women, that harms 50% of the population as far as I'm concerned. And again, yeah, it's just disingenuous. It's, and people have really accepted this idea. A lot of people, progressives, have accepted the idea of that so-called misgendering or dead naming. So, referring to a trans person's actual name that they were born with, not the name that they've decided to take on as a transitioned person, is hateful, and it stops the conversation. People are like, I'm not engaging with you, you're saying something hateful. I'm not listening to you, you're saying something harmful or violent. And yeah, so this tactic has really worked in a lot of ways. I mean, and of course, every time I've ever spoken anywhere, somebody or some group or hundreds of protesters try to deplatform me and bully the venue, bully the organizers, bully the attendees, and often actually threaten. Usually the venues get violent threats, and a lot of violent threats, and the people who organize the events also get violent threats. So and it's scary, and it's intimidating. And we have to have a police presence at all the events we do, and I have to have private security, and bodyguards.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's pretty crazy, and then it absolutely does have an impact on free speech, because some of the venues cave. Most of them don't, partly because, we've, and on our end here in Vancouver, in any case, we have lawyers who help us ensure people keep their contracts and don't back out. But it also instills fear in people. So people are afraid to have the conversation. So many people that I know will tell me privately that they agree with what I'm saying, obviously, but that they would never say anything to their friends or family or publicly about this for fear of being attacked or ostracized or fired from their jobs.
Something that someone else I was speaking to mentioned is they were talking about how the language of a lot of trans activism inherently makes it difficult to have conversations. So, for example, even if you wanted to have a conversation about gender, and even if you were speaking to someone who could, it becomes very difficult when, for example, pronouns are very baked into our language and things like that, and that basically, because of that, it's almost like a situation where there's kind of a presuppositional element to it, where you can't really argue against their position because a lot of because they're redefining so much stuff that you don't really have any nexus points to have the conversation. Because obviously you kind of mentioned how when you're talking about gender as a feminist, they're talking about something completely different. So could you say that maybe a more subtle form of affecting the ability to engage in debate and conversation?
Yeah, totally. It's, if we're not, I mean, I talk about how this impacts media and journalism and data a lot, right? So what's happened in the media is that journalists or reporters will report on violent crimes, often crimes against women and girls, and the whole article it'll be a woman's name, and the reporter will be using female pronouns, and you'll sort of get to the end of the article and sort of maybe realize, sometimes you just have to do your own research, but sometimes you'll sort of realize, or you'll just see the photo, the image in the report and be like, that's a dude. And this whole article is pretending as though some woman has violently attacked somebody or sexually assaulted somebody or murdered somebody, and it completely manipulates public perception, and it also impacts data. I mean, now we're collecting data based on gender identity versus sex, which will impact things like funding for women's services, and impact our understanding of male violence against women in this world, which is something major that, feminists have been working on to analyze and address for so long. But yeah, I mean, it sort of makes it impossible for us to have a real conversation if we can't talk about who's a man and who's a woman, especially if we're talking about predators. it doesn't matter if there's a woman in a change room or a washroom or whatever, but it definitely matters if there's a man in the change room or a washroom. It definitely matters if like a man is asking an esthetician for a Brazilian bikini wax, which essentially means that these estheticians are going to have to be handling a man's genitals. I mean, it feels like mass gaslighting to me.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I did briefly want to just throw out only two. So there's two. I guess we'll say devil's advocate things. Things I've heard, and I'd be interested to hear kind of your response to them. So the first one is you mentioned the idea of sex being a binary. What would you say to people who bring up intersex people? What would be your response to that as an objection?
Yeah, I mean, most people with intersex conditions still are clearly either male or female. There's a pretty wide variety of intersex conditions. So people talk about intersex as though it's one thing, and it's definitely not. You can qualify as intersex if you have, a large clitoris or a very, very small penis. But also, of course, if you have an abnormal mix of chromosomes, let's say, or anyway, I'm not a scientist, so actually I shouldn't be talking about what all these various conditions are because I'm not an expert, but I do know that there's a wide variety of intersex conditions, and I do know that most intersex people are still clearly male or female, but then have an intersex condition. People talk about intersex as though it's a third sex, but it's not. It's just male or female people, or people who have intersex conditions. So I think there's probably a few situations where it really is difficult to determine, which is fine. I mean, you can just be intersex. Like, that's okay, and it should be okay. And, obviously in the past, there was a common practice where a doctor would decide at birth, well, I'm going to turn this intersex baby into a female or a male. And we don't do that anymore, and we recognize that as wrong. And that's a good thing. But the existence of intersex conditions, again, doesn't dissolve the categories of male or female, because most of us don't have intersex conditions. Most of us are very clearly and obviously male and female, and any doctor will be able to determine whether or not we're male or female just through a blood test, never mind through physical observation. Anthropologists, or sorry, like archaeologists and anthropologists, people who you could dig up bones. A scientist, not me, could dig up bones centuries ago and be able to tell easily if those bones belong to a male or a female. It's not really as complicated as people like to kind of pretend it is.
Yeah. And now the next one, this one's a bit more, I guess, theoretical, but a lot of people will say, that there's and this relates to, obviously, about the whole intersectional thing, and maybe you can talk about that too, but they'll say, there's different experiences of womanhood. So like a white woman's going to have a different experience of womanhood to a black woman, and a straight woman's going to have a different experience of womanhood to a lesbian woman. I'll say, well, cis women, they're women, and trans women are women, but they just have different experiences of womanhood. And I was wondering if you've kind of encountered that and thought about the idea that basically people will say, well, trans women and cis women, they're both women. It's just, different experiences of women, in the same way that a black woman and a white woman are both women and have different experiences of womanhood. Do you have any thoughts on that as a, I guess, rebuttal to the idea that, trans identity politics is taking away the integrity of what it means to be a woman?
I mean, first of all, it's silly because men aren't women no matter what they do. Putting on a dress doesn't make a man a woman. So, maybe he could say he has a different experience of femininity, but he can't say he has a different experience of being a woman, because he's not a woman. A woman is an adult human female. That's it. It doesn't have anything to do with these gender stereotypes. So I mean, I think that it's pretty like gross to co-opt that argument, you know, that Black women have made, or that feminists have made to ensure that people understand that women who are poor or working class or living in different parts of the world or racialized and subject to racism might have a different experience in this world than a woman who is rich or white, or, you know, a woman who lives in Canada is going to have a different experience than a woman who lives in South Asia. That's true, obviously. But that doesn't mean that a man who identifies more strongly with femininity or has some kind of mental illness or who desires to be a woman or who has a fetish that involves him like getting turned on by imagining himself to be a woman or dressing up like a woman is a woman just like all these other women. He's not.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, I've only got one more question left, but obviously if you've got any other. So what do you think, what potential do you think there is for cooperation between trans activists and feminists, and obviously in this context implying feminists who disagree with trans activists? Do you think it's possible that there could be an alliance between people who subscribe to queer theory and feminists like yourself, and would you want there to be? In terms of, and obviously in this content, I'm talking about an alliance in dealing with other broader progressive issues.
I mean, sure. Like, I mean, I'm happy to ally with various people on various issues if we happen to agree on those issues. Not all that interested in making formal alliances with people. If we agree, and then we agree, and great. But I think, I mean, in terms of feminism, it's difficult to form alliances with queer theorists because they have such a very different ideology and such very different goals, and they sort of speak a different language than the entire rest of the world. I sort of think they live in a bit of an elitist academic bubble, and I'm not particularly interested in working on those lines or using that kind of language, or, you know, using ideas that don't exist within material reality and that don't actually help real people. But sure, I mean, if queer theorists or trans activists decided to stop attacking women in the feminist movement and started to engage in rational, coherent conversation, then great. You know, like, feminists, I'm sure, would be happy to support trans people in building their own spaces and services if that's something they feel is needed, which they seem to insist it is needed, but then don't bother actually doing that. Just, you know, sort of focus on gaining access to women's spaces.
Okay, yeah, that's good. I'm guessing you probably want to head off for the hour mark at 2 for you. But if you have any other, so that's all my questions. I definitely could have asked more, but I didn't want to, take up too much of your time. But if you have any, final comments or things that you don't think I mentioned, which you'd like to bring up, then please do let me know now.
I can't really think of anything else. No, but I mean, yeah.
They were very good questions from me then.
Okay, cool.
All right. Well, thank you. And I genuinely do. I'll stop recording now. But yeah,